Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. He walked out of the woods alive. 5 seconds later, he was lying face down in the brush, a bullet through his torso. His wife pulled the trigger, and she said she thought he was a bear. This is the story of the hunt that ended a marriage, a life, and maybe a carefully calculated lie. On the evening of September 14th, 2006, a Pennsylvania family was deep in the backwoods of Buchan's Junction, Newfoundland and Labrador. Remote country, thick timberline, no cell reception. The kind of place where you hear more from the wind than you ever will from people. Mark Harshbarger, 41, walked into those woods as part of a hunting party. His wife Mary Beth stayed behind, watching the tree line from the edge of a clearing. A licensed hunter herself, she remained in the vehicle, rifle loaded, safety off. The sun had dropped behind the horizon. Visibility was failing. And within seconds, one shot rang out. The round entered Mark's lower torso. It tore through soft tissue, severed an artery, and exited through his back. He collapsed instantly. He never even called out. According to the only available witness, the hunting guide, Mary exited the vehicle in what he described as mild panic. She reportedly said, "But I thought it was a bear. Did I hit it?" The guide replied flatly, "You hit Mark." Mark's body was found lying roughly 197 feet from the vehicle, slumped near the tree line. No defensive wounds, no sign of movement post-impact. Emergency services were unreachable. The scene was secured by Canadian authorities approximately 90 minutes later, after radio contact was relayed through the guide's backup channel. From the outside, it read like a tragic hunting accident, but law enforcement didn't close the case, because a few things weren't lining up. First, forensic inconsistency. The bullet's path was remarkably direct. Not arced, not rushed. Clean shot placement, lower abdominal region, slightly left of center. That suggested aim, not panic. Second, Mark wasn't wearing blaze orange, an oversight, but he was upright and walking toward the vehicle. That fact, combined with the known positioning of the rifle, called into question how any trained hunter could mistake a human silhouette for a bear at that range. Authorities seized the firearm, a Browning .30-06 bolt-action rifle. It was legally owned, zeroed at 150 yards. They ran ballistics, no malfunctions, no trigger sensitivity. The scope was factory calibrated. In short, this wasn't a negligent misfire. This was a decision. Mary Beth's statement was documented but not immediately released. She claimed she saw a large, dark figure moving in the shadows. She said she raised the rifle, saw movement, and fired. No verbal warning, no second look. RCMP officers on scene recorded her emotional state as distressed but coherent. Notably, no signs of intoxication, no abrasions, no physiological signs of panic outside of minor tremors in her dominant hand. Her first request wasn't for medical help. It was, according to the report, to find her children and get them home. Timeline lock. 7:10 p.m. Shot fired. 7:13 p.m. Hunting guide reports fatality via handheld radio. 8:47 p.m. RCMP secures scene. 9:22 p.m. Medical examiner confirms death. 10:03 p.m. Rifle seized and logged. 11:38 p.m. Mary Beth Harshbarger interviewed voluntarily. Initial forensic analysis was inconclusive. No gunpowder residue on Mark's clothing, unsurprising given the distance. No obstruction between shooter and target. The lighting was low but not fully dark. Moon phase, waning gibbous, cloud cover, clear. What investigators noted, but didn't say publicly, was the intentional feel of the setup. Rifle ready, target unobstructed. One shot, no follow-up. But the biggest red flag wouldn't come from the crime scene. It came from Pennsylvania. Within 72 hours, Mark's life insurance provider reported that Mary Beth had filed a claim. The amount? $550,000. She had called them before she contacted Mark's extended family. 3 days after the shooting, Mary Beth Harshbarger returned to Mashopin, Pennsylvania, with her children and her late husband's remains. There was no police escort, no press conference. Just a quiet arrival into a town that would soon become anything but. Mark Harshbarger's funeral was held on September 19, 2006 at a local Protestant church. Attendance was heavy. The service was brief. His casket was closed. Few details were shared by the family. Fewer still by Mary. What stood out to many attendees wasn't grief, it was precision. Mary Beth handled the arrangements herself. She signed the cremation paperwork within 24 hours of arrival. The obituary made no mention of the nature of death. When she did speak, she offered thanks, not explanations. Investigators took note of this pattern early. Within 72 hours of the incident, Mary Beth had initiated a life insurance claim on Mark's $550,000 policy, a policy he had revised just months earlier to increase coverage. He had also added her as sole beneficiary. The insurance company flagged the timing. They alerted U.S. authorities that the claim had been filed before Canadian investigators had completed their incident review. No autopsy report, no final classification, just paperwork and a signature. Procedurally, it wasn't illegal, but in cases involving firearm-related fatalities, insurance carriers in both the U.S. and Canada typically wait for a final forensic ruling. In this case, the insurer's internal review board issued a fraud alert pending verification. Meanwhile, the RCMP had submitted early findings to the Ontario Forensic Lab. Initial notes confirmed a clean ballistic trajectory from the Browning .30-06 bolt-action rifle, matching the weapon Mary Beth had discharged. No signs of accidental discharge, no mechanical defects. The trigger pull was standard tension. That report reached U.S. investigators assigned to the FBI's legal attaché office in Ottawa. A formal inquiry into the financial aftermath of the shooting was opened. Bank records showed that within 10 days of Mark's death, Mary had paid off their home equity loan and initiated a $23,500 vehicle purchase, a 2007 model SUV. She paid in full. Parallel to the forensic review, behavioral analysts in Pennsylvania were building a post-incident profile. One item stood out. Barry Harshbarger, Mark's younger brother, had moved into Mary Beth's home. According to neighbors, Barry's vehicle was parked outside the house by the end of September. A month after Mark's death, Barry had changed his mailing address to match Mary's residence. By Thanksgiving, they were attending events together. From a legal standpoint, this was circumstantial. But from an investigative lens, it introduced a possible secondary relationship dynamic. And that raised the question, was Mark's death merely a tragic accident or part of something planned? Investigators dug deeper into Mary Beth's financial activity. She had obtained multiple life insurance policies on Mark over the years. The most recent, filed in mid-2006, included a suicide exclusion clause but made no mention of firearm-related accidental death. The increased payout level was approved just 6 weeks before the shooting. She had also adjusted her own coverage around the same time, a detail less known, but one that matched common patterns seen in staged accident investigations. Forensic psychology flagged several markers: sudden debt resolution post-incident, quick change in living arrangements, calm demeanor during post-event interviews, lack of emotional volatility at funeral. While none of these proved intent, they collectively triggered interjurisdictional cooperation. By November 2006, the RCMP was in regular communication with the FBI. Discussions began around the possibility of pursuing criminal negligence charges under Canadian law. But before any indictment could move forward, prosecutors needed certainty on one point. Was the shot plausibly accidental? By late October 2006, the death of Mark Harshbarger had stopped making local headlines. But inside regional and federal databases, his name was still active, tagged across multiple case files, spanning 2 countries and 4 jurisdictions. What began as a fatal hunting incident had shifted into a coordinated financial investigation. Because death, in some cases, isn't just personal, it's profitable. Mark Harshbarger held multiple life insurance policies. The largest, valued at $550,000 USD, had been recently increased and finalized just 6 weeks before the trip to Newfoundland. Paperwork showed the signature was clean, dates matched, and no apparent coercion had occurred. But investigators found the pattern concerning. Mark had also signed a revised will naming Mary Beth as sole beneficiary. The timing wasn't illegal, but it was precise. In a formal request issued under the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, Canadian prosecutors obtained full access to Mary Beth's financial records. And the goal wasn't to prove intent, it was to establish behavior. From June to September 2006, Mary had made 5 separate inquiries about Mark's insurance policies. She contacted 2 agencies directly, requested updated payout schedules, and made a notation in her joint financial files about coverage verification for Tripp. Investigators documented the inquiries, then compared them with her prior activity. Over the course of their marriage, Mary Beth had been listed as primary on 3 different life policies Mark held through employment, private insurers, and a family trust. She had never initiated changes until mid-2006. That shift, when viewed in isolation, could be explained away. But paired with her post-death financial moves, it triggered forensic interest. Within 10 days of the shooting, Mary paid off their $38,000 home equity loan, purchased a new vehicle for $3,500, made 2 payments toward a private education plan for her children, retained a Pennsylvania-based probate attorney to expedite claim processing. All of this occurred prior to the release of Mark's final autopsy. The forensic accounting team labeled her spending timeline as accelerated and front-loaded, not illegal, but consistent with historical models of post-incident financial staging. Back in Newfoundland, RCMP analysts worked to verify Mary Beth's statements about the day of the shooting. She had described Mark approaching the vehicle from dense brush, late in the day, not wearing any blaze orange. That part was true. Mark had opted for dark clothing, likely for camouflage. A common mistake among American hunters unfamiliar with Canadian regulations. But investigators wanted to understand how a trained hunter could mistake a human form for a bear at 197 feet in moderate light conditions. So they ran a test. They reenacted the shot from the exact position Mary had been sitting. Same time of day, same weather, same rifle. They placed a 6-foot silhouette mannequin in the location Mark had been standing. The figure wasn't fuzzy, it wasn't small, and most notably, it moved upright. The results showed that any hunter using a scoped rifle with basic competency would have had at least 3 seconds of visual clarity before pulling the trigger. The RCMP documented the findings and included them in a preliminary risk assessment to Crown prosecutors. Their conclusion: this was no slam dunk for accidental death. Meanwhile, back in Pennsylvania, Barry Harshbarger's residency raised new questions. Phone records showed consistent daily contact between Barry and Mary Beth in the 2 months leading up to the hunting trip. Digital forensics from a seized laptop used by Mary Beth to file insurance documentation contained multiple password entries for both Mary and Barry. Investigators flagged this overlap as unusual for in-law interaction. No personal emails or chat logs revealed explicit romantic conduct, but their cohabitation, financial merging, and shared utilities were listed in a pattern timeline. It's important to note, no direct evidence of a conspiracy existed. There were no messages about planning the shooting, no digital fingerprints of a staged event. But the behavioral alignment between Mary Beth's insurance preparations and Barry's post-death integration into the household suggested more than coincidence. By January 2007, the Department of Justice Canada had assembled enough circumstantial evidence to support a charge of criminal negligence causing death, with an aggravating financial component. Prosecutors cited 3 primary bases: the trajectory analysis indicating deliberate scope use, the pre-trip insurance adjustments, the speed of post-incident financial activity. What made this case unique was its cross-border complexity. Mary Beth was a U.S. citizen. The death occurred in Canada. The crime, if proven, was rooted in behavior, more than ballistics. And the system isn't built to convict behavior alone. One senior RCMP official noted in a memo, "The facts don't scream intent, but they whisper it over and over." October 28, 2006, Buchan's Junction, Newfoundland. Investigators returned to the scene. The RCMP's Forensic Reconstruction Unit had one objective: test whether Mary Beth Harshbarger's account of the shooting was physically and visually plausible. They weren't looking for intent, not yet. They were looking for whether her version of events could be objectively replicated under field conditions. Weather was matched to the original incident: clear skies, post-dusk light drop-off, consistent with a waning gibbous moon. Same rifle model, Browning 30-06 bolt action, same sightline, same distance. They placed a 6-foot upright mannequin in the same location Mark had been standing, according to crime scene logs. The ground had not significantly eroded. Topography, tree line, and the slope near the vehicle remained as recorded. The shooter's perspective was simulated from inside the vehicle's cab. Through the scope, the figure appeared dark, but defined. Its shape moved like a person, not a bear. The silhouette rose vertically from the underbrush, never dropped to all fours, never changed trajectory. 3 key measurements followed. Line of sight exposure, 3.2 seconds before shot range, based on motion trigger data and time-stamped stills. Scope clarity test, 91% shape distinction at dusk using the same glass and magnification. Trigger pressure test. The firearm's bolt action was intact, no misalignment, no evidence of accidental discharge. This wasn't a wild shot fired in panic. It was a single, precise strike from a stable firing position. The round entered Mark's lower left abdomen and exited mid-back, angled slightly upward, confirming the shooter was positioned lower, just as Mary Beth had been. Forensic experts from both Canadian Wildlife Enforcement and the RCMP agreed. The conditions under which Mary Beth claimed she mistook her husband for a bear didn't align with the physical evidence. While accidental shootings do happen during dusk hunts, they typically involve limited sight lines, brush obstructions, or moving game. None of those variables were present here. RCMP forensic biologist Dr. Elaine Martins reviewed soil disturbance near the scene. There was no indication of rushing, slipping, or repositioning. The shooter hadn't adjusted under duress. There was time, enough time to aim. The Department of Justice in Newfoundland compiled these findings into an internal memo, stating the ballistic evidence was inconsistent with a sudden misidentification under duress. That language didn't directly accuse Mary Beth of intent, but it created prosecutorial momentum. Parallel to this, a review of the rifle's zeroing logs at the U.S. dealer, where Mark had bought it, showed recent calibration work. He had taken the rifle in for sighting in late August, less than 3 weeks before the trip. The scope was confirmed as accurate up to 150 yards. This wasn't a beginner's setup. It was ready, tested, and capable. Investigators also returned to the 911 equivalent radio call made by the guide that night. It had been short and direct. Hunting accident, male, 40s, shot, dead on arrival. The guide wasn't calling for help. He was reporting a death. He later testified that Mary's immediate reaction had not included an attempt to check Mark's pulse or call out to him. She had said she thought it was a bear, but made no move toward the body. Forensic psychologist Dr. Glenn Ruddock, assigned to review behavioral patterns post-shooting, flagged this as a potentially relevant non-action. In fatal shooting cases involving spouses, there is typically a short burst of denial or shock-based response. Ruddock noted the absence of those behaviors may not prove guilt, but they could inform intent. Still, prosecutors weren't building a murder case. That required motive, premeditation, and indisputable proof. What they were building, slowly and methodically, was a case for criminal negligence causing death under Canadian statute. That charge doesn't require the Crown to prove murder. It requires them to prove that a reasonable person in the same position would not have fired the shot. And the reconstruction team believed they had just proven that very point. On November 14, 2006, RCMP concluded their forensic review and submitted their final report to provincial prosecutors. The recommendation was clear: proceed with formal charges. But this wouldn't be a simple indictment. Mary Beth Harshbarger was a USC citizen. The shooting had taken place on Canadian soil. That meant extradition would be required. From this point forward, the investigation wasn't just about what happened in the woods. It became a legal chess match between nations, about where a person can be held accountable when death crosses a border. December 4, 2006. Corner Brook Detachment, Royal Canadian Mounted Police. A plain envelope arrived by standard post, no return address. Inside, a single page, printed, not handwritten. The message was short, direct, and unsigned. She didn't mistake him for a bear. Ask Barry what he really saw. There was no punctuation beyond the period, no names, but no ambiguity either. Investigators scanned the envelope for fingerprints. None. The ink was toner-based, from a standard laser printer. The paper stock was generic, postmark, St. John's. It offered no traceable lead, but the content couldn't be ignored. To this point, every aspect of the investigation had been built on physical evidence, trajectory, scope clarity, insurance behavior. There had been no direct allegation of intent. This changed that. Even though it was anonymous, the letter redirected the investigative lens toward something they hadn't formally pursued, whether Barry Harshbarger had witnessed more than he'd disclosed. Barry had been part of the hunting trip. He'd been in the area at the time of the shot. His original statement, taken 2 days after the incident, was vague. He reported walking behind Mark and the guide, returning toward the vehicle and hearing a single rifle discharge. He claimed he didn't see the moment it happened. RCMP detectives reopened his statement. They cross-referenced GPS tag data from the outfitter's satellite tracker. While not exact, the tracker showed proximity overlap between Mark, Barry, and Mary Beth within the same quarter-acre area at the time of the shooting. Not definitive, but close enough to raise questions about visibility. Barry was re-interviewed on December 11th. The tone of the session changed from procedural to targeted. When asked whether he had seen Mary raise the rifle, he hesitated. He said he remembered the sound, remembered turning, but didn't know where exactly she had aimed. But the investigators noticed a change. Barry was more cautious this time, less certain, more careful in how he phrased things. They followed with a quiet background check, public records, employment, and financial data. Barry had changed his listed residential address to Mary Beth's home just 6 weeks after Mark's death. He had no documented source of income during that period. Yet credit card statements showed purchases consistent with someone living in a 2-income household. Again, none of this proved anything criminal, but in cases where intent is buried, behavior becomes its own kind of evidence. An internal memo from RCMP to the Crown outlined 3 new points of concern. Barry's proximity to the incident remained unclear and possibly underreported. His relationship with Mary Beth had shifted quickly and substantially post-death. The anonymous letter, though unverified, introduced a potential undisclosed witness or whistleblower. Despite these findings, no charges were filed against Barry. But his status quietly shifted from witness to person of interest. Not in a homicide, yet, but in what Canadian law would define as obstruction or misrepresentation in the course of an active investigation. Back in Pennsylvania, local whispers were spreading. Neighbors had begun asking questions long before the police did. Why was Barry still living in the house? Why had Mary Beth bought him a vehicle? These weren't legal issues, but they were moral signals. People around them were starting to distance themselves. One RCMP officer later described it plainly. You don't need a confession when behavior gives you the outline. The letter was never traced. No matching printer, no DNA, no follow-up message. But it stayed in the case file. Stapled to the inside flap, a quiet note that signaled something louder than evidence, a doubt. And sometimes, in cases like this, a doubt is where the real questions start. May 6, 2008, Scranton, Pennsylvania. A U.S. Marshal served a provisional arrest warrant on Mary Beth Harshbarger at her home in Wyoming County. The charge, criminal negligence causing death, filed by Canadian authorities, originating from the shooting death of her husband Mark in Newfoundland nearly 2 years earlier. It had taken time to get here. The forensic reconstruction had raised questions. The insurance behavior had raised more. The anonymous letter, still unverified, had tilted the case into another category entirely. And now, the Canadian Crown was formally requesting that Mary Beth be brought back across the border to stand trial. But bringing a U.S. citizen into a foreign criminal court isn't a matter of just filing paperwork. It's a negotiation between 2 systems, both sovereign, both politically sensitive, both with their own thresholds of justice. Extradition, in this case, wasn't guaranteed. The process began with a diplomatic note, Canada formally submitting its request through the U.S. Department of Justice under the Extradition Treaty of 1971. The treaty allows either country to request custody of individuals charged with crimes that would also be considered criminal under the laws of the other. Canada's position was clear. Based on the forensic trajectory, timing of the insurance actions, and behavior post-incident, they had cause to believe Mary Beth acted with gross negligence. That charge, under Canadian law, carries the same prosecutorial weight as manslaughter, though it stops short of requiring intent. In the U.S., however, negligent homicide laws vary by state, and Pennsylvania did not classify accidental hunting deaths at this level unless further malice was evident. This made the extradition request a gray zone. The federal court would have to determine whether what Canada deemed criminal negligence causing death met the threshold of a dual criminality offense, a legal concept requiring that the conduct be considered a crime in both countries. The hearing began in July 2008 at the U.S. District Court for the Middle District of Pennsylvania. The judge reviewed forensic reports, including RCMP's reenactment photos, soil analysis logs, and trigger tension data. The prosecution emphasized a key point. This was not a misfire. It was a clear shot, center mass, fired from a rested position by someone trained to know better. Mary Beth's defense centered on procedural argument. Her team claimed the incident was a tragic mistake, one already subject to U.S. review, and that extraditing her would constitute double jeopardy in principle, if not in technical law. The judge disagreed. In a written ruling issued in late September, the court found that Canada's charge met the dual criminality standard. The crime alleged would also constitute a form of involuntary manslaughter under U.S. law, had it occurred within American jurisdiction. With that decision, Mary Beth was ordered to surrender for extradition. She appealed immediately. The process would drag for nearly 2 more years, with motions filed in both district and appellate courts. Throughout that period, Mary Beth remained free on bond. She lived in the same home, raised her children, and appeared occasionally in public, often declining interviews. The media interest had slowed, but the case file had not. Behind closed doors, the Canadian Crown held strategy meetings on whether to proceed to trial without new direct evidence. They didn't have a confession, no eyewitness statement, only behavior. But in the view of senior prosecutors, that behavior was cumulative. By early 2010, the final appeal was denied. Mary Beth was taken into federal custody and formally extradited to Canada in May 2010. She arrived under full escort, accompanied by a legal team. Her trial would be heard not by a jury, but by a single judge in the Supreme Court of Newfoundland and Labrador. Prosecutors would face a narrow but important burden: prove that Mary Beth Harshbarger, in firing her rifle that evening in 2006, acted so recklessly that death became a foreseeable outcome. They didn't need to prove murder, but they needed to prove that what happened in that clearing was more than a mistake. October 5, 2010. Supreme Court of Newfoundland and Labrador, Corner Brook. After 4 years of international legal movement and over a dozen procedural motions, Her Majesty the Queen Fee, Mary Beth Harshbarger was formally called to bench trial. No jury, just one judge, the Honorable Richard LeBlanc. This format wasn't unusual for Canadian law, especially in complex or high-profile negligence cases. The absence of a jury meant one thing: the burden of persuasion fell entirely on the clarity of fact, not sentiment. Opening statements were reserved. The Crown laid out its central argument, that on the evening of September 14, 2006, Mary Beth Harshbarger acted with reckless disregard for human life when she discharged a high-powered rifle into what she claimed she believed was a bear, when in fact, it was her husband, Mark. The prosecution led with the forensic reconstruction report, already entered into evidence pre-trial. It included a time-stamped video of the reenactment, showing the visibility window, sightline exposure, and scope targeting calibration. The clip was short, just 8 seconds, but it became the core of the trial's physical evidence. Next came ballistics expert testimony. The .30-06 rifle had been tested again before trial. The expert confirmed no defects, standard trigger weight, stable zeroing at 150 yards. The shot pattern showed deliberate alignment, not a flinch, not a stagger. No environmental obstructions were recorded that could have distorted perception. On day 2, the court heard from Dr. Elaine Martins, the forensic biologist who oversaw the soil and terrain analysis. Her findings reasserted what had been included in the Crown's recommendation to charge. No signs of hurried repositioning by the shooter, no loss of footing, no deviation in stance. Her conclusion was professional and concise. The position of the shooter was stable, controlled. The defense countered with a narrative built on tragic error. Mary Beth's counsel argued that the area was rugged, the hour was late, and Mark was not wearing the mandated blaze orange safety vest required under Canadian wildlife law. That failure, they said, created the conditions for mistake. They also argued emotional context. Mary Beth had no prior criminal history, was a mother of two, and cooperated fully at the scene. Her attorneys called a behavioral psychologist to testify that post-shooting shock often leads to flattened emotional expression, in reference to her composed demeanor after the shot. But the Crown challenged that framing through testimony from RCMP officer Kevin Goss, the first responder at the scene. Goss reported that Mary Beth did not check her husband's body, did not attempt CPR, and did not cry until authorities arrived. His final line carried weight. She looked at me like someone who was already sure of the outcome. Midway through trial, Barry Harshbarger was called to testify under subpoena. His role in the aftermath had drawn attention since Chapter 5's anonymous letter. Barry held to his original statement, that he heard the shot but did not witness it. When asked about his living arrangements with Mary Beth post-shooting, he answered cautiously, stating it was a way to help with the kids. His testimony didn't shift the case, but it didn't help the defense either. The judge was methodical in questioning witnesses. He pushed on technical details, scope magnification, the typical behavior of bears at dusk, the standard safety procedure in hunting groups. The questions weren't about feelings. They were about whether Mary Beth's actions matched those of someone trained in outdoor firearm safety. The trial lasted 8 days. No sudden breakdowns, no confessions. Just methodical analysis, witness by witness, chart by chart. When closing arguments concluded, Justice LeBlanc reserved judgment. 4 days later, on October 13, 2010, the verdict was delivered. Mary Beth Harshbarger was acquitted. The judge ruled that while her actions were questionable, they did not meet the criminal threshold required under Canadian law. Specifically, the Crown had not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that her behavior reached the level of wanton or reckless disregard for life. She was released that same day. In the hallway outside the courtroom, the Harshbarger family was silent. The mother of the deceased did not speak to press. She later told reporters, "This wasn't justice, it was procedure." The courtroom in Grand Falls, Windsor fell into an uneasy silence when the verdict was read aloud, not guilty. Mary Beth Harshbarger stood still as the words echoed through the chamber. Her face gave nothing away. Her attorneys offered restrained nods. For many, it was a quiet end to a loud and complex story. But outside those four walls, the noise had just begun. In the days that followed, the ruling reverberated far beyond the legal confines of Newfoundland and Labrador. Legal analysts across North America debated the implications of the case, not just as a cross-border criminal prosecution, but as a rare example of a spouse accused of fatally shooting their partner and being acquitted on the grounds of mistaken identity during a sanctioned hunting trip. Media outlets ran side-by-side images of Mark and Mary Beth, headlines varying from "Justice served in the wilderness" to "A fatal mistake" or "Calculated cover." The public was polarized. Some viewed Mary Beth as a tragic figure who had made a life-altering error. Others saw in her a woman who had outmaneuvered the system. And for a small hunting town in Canada and a grieving family in Pennsylvania, closure remained elusive. From a legal standpoint, the case had followed due process. The prosecution had failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Mary Beth had intentionally shot her husband. The defense had presented compelling expert testimony, limited visibility at dusk, the use of a .30-06 rifle, Mark's dark clothing, and his positioning while returning from a scouting path, all consistent with a hunting accident. The jury had been instructed to weigh intent carefully. They did, and found her not criminally responsible. But the deeper impact of the trial was not contained in the verdict alone. In the months that followed, discussions emerged within outdoor safety and hunting education communities. Though Mark was an experienced hunter and Mary Beth had completed basic hunting instruction, the case exposed glaring issues in communication protocols during group hunts. Experts emphasize the importance of clear signals, high-visibility clothing, and designated fire zones. In Pennsylvania and Ontario, updated training modules began citing the Harshbarger case as a cautionary tale, not to condemn, but to instruct. More quietly, the case left its mark on the Harshbarger family. Mark's brother, Barry Harshbarger, issued a statement to the press weeks after the acquittal. His voice was measured but heavy. "We didn't get justice in the courtroom, but we know who Mark was. A good man, a father, a brother. He deserved better." The family held a private memorial service. No cameras, no interviews, just friends, relatives, and a young son who would grow up with the headline of his father's death, archived online forever. Mary Beth returned to Pennsylvania. There were no parades, no welcoming signs. Her real sentence began not with handcuffs, but with public scrutiny. In the years since, she has largely avoided media. Her hunting license was never reinstated. She sold the couple's cabin property. Her son, now a teenager, lives mostly outside public view. The last known statement Mary Beth made publicly was during trial. "I thought it was a bear." And yet, for those who followed the case closely, questions remained, not necessarily of guilt, but of responsibility. Could a seasoned hunter truly mistake a 6-foot-tall man for a bear? Why was the shot fired so quickly with no verbal confirmation? Why had she told a dispatcher, "My husband's been shot," before explaining that she was the shooter herself? The prosecution had tried to use these details to suggest intent. The jury disagreed. But the inconsistencies never fully left the public conscience. From an investigative standpoint, the forensic reconstruction had been clear. There was no evidence of a close-range shot, no sign of a struggle, no digital evidence of prior threats or motive. Financial records did not suggest Mary Beth stood to gain significantly from Mark's death. Their life, by all accounts, was ordinary. The only extraordinary variable was the bullet that struck him behind the ear in a dense Canadian forest at twilight. Sometimes, that's all it takes to change the course of multiple lives. The Harshbarger case has since been cited in legal discussions involving mens rea, the intention or knowledge of wrongdoing. Law schools debated whether her actions amounted to criminal negligence or excusable accident. But law is not emotion. Law is evidence, thresholds, and doubt. The jury had seen what it needed to see. But we, as a society, see more. We see the fragile line between accident and accountability. We see how easily a tragedy can become a crime, or not, depending on the circumstances, the timing, and the burden of proof. We see how, even when the law speaks, not all wounds are closed. This case leaves behind no simple lesson. There is no moral parable neatly tied in a bow. But it leaves questions worth carrying forward. How well do we train for life or death responsibility in leisure environments? How do we define justice when no one walks away whole? How do we honor the memory of someone lost in a moment that will never be fully explained? And perhaps most hauntingly, what would we have done in her place or in his? Looking back, what happened in that forest wasn't just a tragedy. It was a reminder of how quickly life can change and how critical it is to act with awareness, responsibility, and care. As someone who has followed this case deeply, I've come to realize justice isn't always black and white, and sometimes even the truth leaves us with questions. So I ask you, what do you believe justice looks like in a case like this? And more importantly, how can we prevent future tragedies like this from happening again? If this story touched you or made you think differently, leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from or share your thoughts. And if you didn't like this video, tell me why. I'm here to grow with you. If you believe stories like these matter, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Your voice helps shape this community.